Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture for Chapter 2 on Environmental Policy and Ethics. Today in this lecture we're going to cover a range of topics, including a brief history of changing views of humans and nature, environmental ethics, what do we mean by environmental ethics, the environment and the marketplace, as well as valuing ecosystems, so how do we think of and value the environment, a brief overview of environmental policy, what that is, and how we decide to make environmental policy and how we enact it. And then also very briefly, U.S. environmental law and policy. And I'm not going to cover specific policy. We'll get into specific policies as the semester continues, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about how it works in the United States. Your textbook covers international law and policy briefly. I'm not going to cover that in lecture, but I would like you to also read about that. So your textbook gives a great example of Hetch Hetchy. And so the Hetch Hetchy Valley is in Yosemite National Park. And the river there drains Yosemite National Park and the surrounding area, and the geological structure there was ideal for a reservoir. It's in a national park, which kind of makes it unique. And proponents opposed use as a reservoir and originally won because they didn't want to destroy this beautiful valley. If you've been to Yosemite Valley, it looked very similar to Yosemite Valley, these beautiful granite walls that were carved by glaciers. But eventually the people who did want the reservoir won after a fire hit San Francisco, and part of the reason that the Great Fire of San Francisco spread was that they didn't have a reliable water source. So what they wound up doing was creating the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in order to provide a steady water source for San Francisco. This is Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. When John Muir originally talked Teddy Roosevelt into preserving the Hetch Hetchy Valley as part of Yosemite National Park. But again, later on, people who needed water won out, and it was a very rare case where you have this reservoir, they flooded the valley, and in order to provide this steady source of water to San Francisco. And so we're going to talk about how decisions like that get made, because in this case, a lot of people still want to restore Hetch Hetchy. They want to drain that reservoir. They said it should have never been flooded in the first place. But how did we value that resource of water versus the valley itself, versus the natural beauty and the wildlife that was living there? So we're going to talk about kind of all those competing views today, and that's a great example of it. But just really briefly, kind of how views of humans and nature have shifted. So first I'm going to talk about pre-industrial views, so views before the Industrial Revolution. Right, so you have not just before the Industrial Revolution, but before that as well. But a lot of people practicing kind of animism and kind of being very closely tied to nature, thinking of living and non-living objects as having a soul or a spirit. This is a common religious feature for indigenous people and indigenous populations. And then you have the domestication of plants and animals, and humans altering the ecosystem to a heavier degree than they ever had before. And during that agricultural development, monotheism, or as opposed to worshiping multiple gods, monotheism, this rise of kind of worshiping one god, rises during agricultural development. It's not that polytheism doesn't exist today in the world. It certainly does. Hinduism, polytheism, it exists. But you see that initial rise of monotheism happen, and you get new beliefs that mostly remove humans from nature as opposed to humans being part of nature. And so we're going to see this kind of shift back and forth. And then you get the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and new technology and new scientific understanding. We start to understand things like evolution and botany and zoology and environmental connections. We also get this idea of transcendentalism, which is this philosophy that kind of nature is divine. So again, kind of a little bit of a shift back, and you get the birth of the modern environmental movement. There were lots of people that saw with increased urbanization and industrialization that the environment was being harmed. There was visible pollution. And so you get people like Thoreau, who writes his famous works at Walden Pond, where he goes out to connect with nature. These are some kind of, during the times of these kind of first big environmentalists that are writing about kind of preserving nature and being out in nature and being reconnected to the land. During this time, you start to get these two competing views of the environment. And so we definitely covered this. If you took 170 last semester, we definitely covered this, but if you haven't, it's important to cover it here. There's the preservationist view, which is definitely John Muir's side of things, where parks and public land should be preserved in their wild, natural, pristine state. All hands are off, right? We're just preserving it, versus this conservationist view that it should be used and managed sustainably to provide the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. Timber, water, etc. may be used sustainably. So it's not about being unsustainable, but basically to benefit the greatest number of people. So when we think back to the Hetch Hetchy, preservationists would say, hands off, that valley should have never been touched. Conservationists said, we should manage that water to benefit the most number of people. And then in the modern era, we start to get kind of a new environmental wave. Environmental trends and debates and warnings dominate the media. This film, An Inconvenient Truth, about global climate change comes out around the year 2000, I believe, or 2001, makes a bunch of headlines. They also get entwined with global politics, right? We have people kind of trying to negotiate international climate accords, but we begin to understand our dependence on ecosystems. And again, this is particularly heightened by the conversation about climate change. As the climate changes, as our ecosystem services, don't forget we talked about ecosystem services last time, are affected, we really kind of understand that we are dependent upon these things. And also this idea of environmental stewardship, right? We should be good stewards of the environment and start taking care of the environment. When we think about environmental ethics, right, we want to think about it's hard to think about environmental ethics and not say like somebody is unethical or ethical, but we want to think about how people think about doing what they believe is the right thing, right? And kind of what are these main ethical traditions with concerns to the environment. So we're going to talk about this a couple different ways, but there's virtue ethics, where basically you're kind of motivated by specific virtues, kindness, loyalty, justice, etc. There's consequence-based ethics, right? You're more worried about the outcome. And again, these overlap and are not mutually exclusive. But things like, are you receiving a benefit or a harm? And then utilitarianism, which is the greatest good for the most people. These are kind of duty-based ethics. They are based on a set of rules or laws. Lying, for example, always wrong, right? So we can think about applying these different types of ethics to the environment. And here you see people protesting to stop the Keystone XL pipeline, which was in the news quite a bit in the past few years. But there are kind of two big ways that people value the environment. There's more than that, but there's kind of these two major shifts where things have intrinsic value, which means people, organism, objects, they have their own inherent value, as opposed to instrumental value, which are things that are valued as a means to something else, right? A panda has its own intrinsic value to exist and be there, as opposed to just thinking about a bamboo forest and thinking about, okay, how can I use this bamboo forest to make clothing or bamboo floors or a variety of other things that we use bamboo for. So looking at things kind of intrinsically, right? They deserve to exist just for their own sake, as opposed to how we are going to use them for something else. So people can talk about preserving the rainforest for its amazing beauty and wildlife, and people can talk about preserving the rainforest because there are a lot of medicines there that we haven't discovered yet. So looking at it from these kind of two different stances. And when we think about environmental ethics, there's also kind of three other ways that we can divide it up. We can talk about people having anthropocentric ethics, which means that humans only have an intrinsic value, and everything else is looked at through its instrumental value, right? Everything else that helps humans. So when we go back to that very much separating man from nature, this would be talking about that. We can look at biocentric ethics, where all living things have an intrinsic value. And then we can talk about ecocentric ethics, where not just all living things have value, but all communities and ecosystems, living and non-living. And we also have the deep ecology movement, which your text talks about, which is where we think of humans kind of as just one part of this global ecology. You're going to watch a film about Wangari Maathai, who started the Greenbelt movement, and you're going to answer some questions about that for your activity. But I want you to think about these issues of environmental ethics when you're watching that film. And then there's also the idea of ecofeminism. So if you've studied feminism in any class, feminism being just the idea that, women should be equal to men at its most basic form, but there's this idea of intersectional feminism, where kind of different forms of discrimination overlap and operate together. So ecofeminism fosters feminine concerns for interrelationships among humans, non-human life, and the environment, due to the fact that women suffer disproportionately from the human destruction of the environment, and people argue that destruction of the environment and subjugation of women is all kind of part of patriarchy. So this is another way that people kind of frame this environmental ethics. And then lastly is environmental justice, which seeks to protect natural resources for all, regardless of race, gender, or economic status. So generally speaking, communities of color and poor communities are more likely to face environmental degradation and pollution. Right? If you're going to place a trash incinerator, it's not going to be in a wealthy neighborhood, it's going to be in a poorer neighborhood. And this is involved in many international treaties and negotiations on global issues, concerns for developing regions. Some of the dirtiest things that are dirtiest for the environment occur in some of the poorest countries. So generally speaking, for example, recycling plastic is a very dirty process, which tends to not happen in the United States. We tend to ship that somewhere else. So now moving on to the environment and the marketplace, we're going to think about how the environment operates in the marketplace. And so first I want to talk about just kind of economic systems first, which is you have a subsistence economy, where basically a society is kind of meeting its needs without gaining wealth, right? Everybody is just kind of usually this is an agricultural setting. I'm basically growing food for myself. I may barter some, but I am just using the environment and I am kind of meeting my own needs, as opposed to a market economy, which we have where the production and consumption take place in markets guided by prices, right? So we do not live in a subsistence economy, generally speaking, anymore. We go out, we purchase our food, we purchase our electricity, our fuel, everything else in an open market. And in a free market economy, the government does not influence the marketplace with subsidies, taxation, or regulation. We do not live in a totally free market economy. Different administrations have been more free market or less free market, right? But fossil fuels are heavily subsidized in our country. We pay taxes, and we deal with regulations. And when we think about, I'm not going to get too much into economics. Your book really gets kind of in the weeds about it, which you don't necessarily need to. But, there is the idea of supply and demand. Excuse me. And so generally with the idea of supply and demand is that you kind of reach this market equilibrium of a price based upon the available supply, and the demand. And as your available supply goes down, your price will go up because there is less to have. or if you have an abundance of something, your price will be lowered, right? So think about, at the end of the season of a particular, I don't know, Christmas decorations, right? You have a bunch of stuff, not many people are demanding for it, and you're trying to just get rid of that supply so the prices drop. When we think about the environment, there are all types of things that kind of mess with this supply and demand model that aren't necessarily indicative of what's actually happening in the environment. And so when we give something an economic value, it's the price consumers will pay. It is not a fixed amount. The more you have, the less you are willing to pay. And a discount rate is the rate at which the economic value declines over time, right? So we can think about, again, if water is super abundant, you are going to be less willing to pay more for water, right? So, and you also, your satisfaction of the benefit goes down. If something is all around you, you don't really feel like, oh, this is a rare thing that I have to pay for, as opposed to if it is not very abundant at all, you are going to be really willing to pay a lot more for that. There are some things that complicate these markets. So free markets can deplete resources, right? If you have nothing in there kind of controlling what's happening with that resource, you can have a depletion of those resources and then these externalized costs and benefits. And so positive externalities are when a third party benefits, and negative externalities are when a third party suffers. And so I'm going to give you the example of timber. If I own this piece of land and I have all of these trees on it, I am going to say like, okay, I'm going to not cut these trees down for however many years until I'm ready to make the most profit. So during that time where the trees are standing, the third party, the local community, is possibly benefiting from these trees. It's good for the environment to have the trees there, but also maybe people are hiking during those in that forest that I am not coming down. So they are getting this positive externality. It's not the thing that I am aiming to do, but it is happening, right? It's this externalized benefit. And then there can be negative externalities as well. When I finally cut those trees down, maybe there's going to be some sort of pollution or more erosion from that is going to hurt local waterways. And people are now going to lose the ability to use that resource for recreation, right? So third parties are going to suffer. They have nothing to do with that timber at all, right? They're not part of that transaction, but they are in how these externalities play out. And we usually see these negative externalities play out very often with kind of loss of recreation and pollution, right? So you have these external costs that cause problems to human well-being all the time. If you do mountaintop removal mining, which we'll talk about later in the semester, and you pollute local waterways, right, then you are going to have this cost to human well-being. And part of the problem with the environment too is that there's unknown costs and benefits. Not all costs are currently known. And so, for example, we could think about smoking. Smoking many years ago was actually promoted by doctors as like a great thing to do, and they was advertised all over the place. And we did not realize all of the average person didn't know all of the health costs of smoking, but also the people who were around who were not even smoking. We didn't really understand how deadly secondhand smoke could be, right? If you grew up in a home where smoking was happening, which is why now we have these very kind of strict smoking laws everywhere. We can also have problems dealing with limited resources because economic models tend to treat resources as infinite or interchangeable, and that is rarely true, right? Those trees are not infinite. We could cut them down. Eventually they will regenerate, but it can take a very long time. And just because you lose that forest does not mean you can exchange it for another forest down the road. So I'm also going to talk a little bit how we value ecosystems, going back to kind of how we were talking about ethics, but we can give them kind of an economic valuation or a price tag for nature. What is the cost of an ecosystem? So we can talk about the marginal value. What is the willingness to pay for that compared to an alternative? What is your willingness to pay to have that forest preserve as opposed to going to another forest? The travel cost valuation, how much people are willing to pay to travel to visit that ecosystem. You can think about Yosemite having a very high travel cost valuation. People will travel from very far to see Yosemite value. And then you can have a hedonic valuation, which is the difference of real estate price affected by environmental alternatives. So again, how much of that how much is that land worth compared to alternatives? And then a contingent value is a value based on what people are willing to pay. So we can think again about Yosemite Valley being valued. That is a very hard sentence to say. Yosemite Valley being valued, right? How much are people willing to pay to get into that park? And then when we think about ecological valuation, right, we can measure things in a different way. The value of an ecosystem measured by the cost of the possible loss of that ecosystem, the natural capital, right? How much of Earth's resources that humans depend upon are in that ecosystem. What will it cost if it is lost to us? What did it cost for Hetch Hetchy to be lost? For example, deforestation may lead to flooding due to erosion. So if you look at an aerial view of Haiti versus the Dominican Republic, Haiti heavily deforested, Dominican Republic did not. They are on the same island of Hispaniola together, and you can quite easily see the border. I will probably show it at some point later in the semester. But, what is the value of losing that ecosystem when you later on are affected by flooding? And, we can't necessarily think of the value of ecosystems and ecosystem services based upon how much there is. Because when we look at the purple bars here are the percent of total value of ecosystem services versus the percent of the total Earth's area, right? So open ocean provides us with quite a bit of ecosystem services, but wetlands provide a higher percentage, but account for a much lower overall percent of the Earth's area. They're super, super valuable. That's why there are many laws now where you cannot destroy wetlands, or if you do, you have to create or preserve wetlands somewhere else.